Hello BIO178, welcome to our next video, and in this video I will focus on the results section of our group project. So here again is that template that I've been using as reference, and here we are focusing on this results section. So overall in the results section what you're doing is telling and showing the audience or your readers what data and results you got as a result of your study. So first of all, we'll talk about what specific things you should be including in this results section. And the first thing I would note is that you need to divide up your results section into at least two different subsections. So I have at least here because this really is going to be specific depending on your particular group's project. So you need to at least have two different subsections that your group is going to pick based on your particular data. You'll need to come up with different subheadings for each of those as well. So you need at least two different subsections in your results section. Here I'm showing an example of what might be one subsection based on a lab we've done previously. Your first subsection might be something like a haplotype network. So this again is that network that we created way back in, what was that now, week 4, I think. And this is based on the data from Dr. Ballerini. So that's one example of a subsection where you would include that figure and then have a written description describing that haplotype network. Another subsection that might be included with that same data set is related to any statistics that were run on that data. So in this case, for this example, you might include something about an AMOVA analysis of genetic variation. We haven't done AMOVAs in our class, but just to explain, it's basically a way to see if the genetic differentiation among different populations or different groups is significant. So in this example here on the right, I have an excerpt from a poster from a BIO178 group last year. And here you can see they have two different subsections. They have one section on haplotype analysis. This was their haplotype network. And then they have a second section describing the results of the AMOVA. And for each of those sections, note they have both a written description and some kind of graphic with a figure caption. Same here for the AMOVA, they have a written description. In this case, the visual is a table, and that table also has a caption. So in your results section, you'll also need to include any relevant data, all relevant data, in fact, to support the conclusions that you're making, which we'll talk about in the next video. And so that relevant data includes a couple different things. One of the things it includes is the results of statistical tests. So oftentimes you'll be reporting those statistical tests in a written format. So as an example, your group might say something like, analyses indicated sex bias dispersal is not occurring. And then what you could do is what I have bolded here, put in parentheses the relevant statistical values to support that claim. So you might say something here, you'd give the t statistic and the p-value. The p-value is 0.12, which indicates in this case that it's not significant. So you can write the results of statistical tests in written format. That's one way to do it. Again, this will depend on your particular group's project though. Here I'm showing another example where if you have a bunch of statistics, this is like the results we got from the week 5 genetic diversity analysis we did in our lab. Here you're getting the output in a table. And so if you're getting multiple statistics and it's not easy for you to put in a single written format like is shown here with the t-test and the p-value, you can also put it in the form of a table. So whichever makes the most sense for your particular group. So you want to make sure you're including the results of the statistical tests, and then along with that you also want to make sure you're including tables if they're relevant and graphs. Again, each of those needs to have its own caption. So here's an example on the left of a table you might include, and you want to make sure you include a caption to describe what's contained within that table. And as I've mentioned a little bit already, in addition, you want to make sure you have some kind of written description to accompany your statistics and your figures. So you can't just have a bunch of different figures and captions in your results section. You also need to include some written description, written sentences describing your results. On the right here, I have an example. This is pulled from that poster template example that I gave you. Here in bold at the top, this is an example of that subsection heading. So you will need to come up with that specifically for your group. And then you also have the written description here. Again, note in the written description, you're describing your results and you're also referencing the figures and tables relevant to whatever you're describing. So here, this first sentence, for example, says southern populations reached higher temperatures than northern populations, in parentheses, figure 3. That's shown right here. So that claim that you've made in the written description is supported by this figure 3 that's showing the temperature profiles for the 6 study sites. So when you're writing your written description, you also want to make sure that is referencing what is shown in the figure. In your written description, you're also providing some additional details where relevant. So that first sentence just says southern populations reached higher temperatures than northern populations, but we can give even more detail than that. If we look at the second sentence, here we're providing some specifics. So here we say La Jolla had the highest average daily maximum. We're giving an actual temperature and absolute maximum. Again, giving a temperature, while Pigeon Point, a Northern California site, as we know from the color coding, had the lowest average daily maximum. Again, we're giving a specific temperature and absolute maximum. Here we're giving another temperature and also providing a reference to a table. So when you're writing these written descriptions, it is important to provide some kind of overall summary, like I just did here, but you're also providing some specifics about your data that maybe aren't necessarily inherently clear from looking at your figure, and or there's certain points that you want to make sure you emphasize in your written description because they're important for your results and your corresponding conclusions. So here's an example. Again, I pulled this from the template that I gave you. This is an example of a results section. This top portion here is what we just discussed on the previous slide. And what you will note here is that this results section should take up about a whole column on your poster. So just as a metric, a guideline for you, it should take up a whole column. Okay, so how do we go about writing the information in this results section or gathering that information? The first thing you'll want to do is analyze the data that's been provided for you. So here, again, I have an image of that portion of the Canvas module. Remember, each of your groups has a project-specific data page. That's where the data is available for you. And then what you want to do is, of course, analyze that data. And as mentioned previously, that analysis will be based very much on analyses we've already done this semester in lab. So I would remind you again that in particular, if you go back to the different lab modules we have on Canvas, the page within each module with the lab instructions and video tutorials, that's going to be especially helpful for you as you're doing the actual analysis with your new data set. This information here has the written description and video tutorials to help refresh your memory and walk you through how to do the different analyses. And for each of your groups, there's going to be 1 week's analysis that's particularly relevant for the analysis you'll need to do with your new novel data set. So when you're analyzing that provided data, it's going to give you a couple different things that you want to make sure you include on your poster, right? So the first thing it'll give you is the results of the statistics. This is an example we've already shown previously. And it's also, you want to make sure you're getting some kind of visual representation of your data. So it might be a box plot like I'm showing here. It could be a table. And again, I'm definitely encourage you to not only just exactly replicate and recreate the analysis we did in our previous labs, but again, think outside the box, ask more questions based on what you've learned, and see if you can come up with different ways to analyze or visualize the data. But at a minimum, you should be making sure that your analysis you're doing is giving you some kind of statistical results and a visual, graphical, or tabular representation of your results, of your data. And then what you need to do is just write that corresponding text. So again, remember, you want to give some kind of broad summary of the data. And you also want to give some additional specifics. And once you have that, you have your statistics, you have the graphical or tabular representation, each with its own caption, you have the written corresponding text. You can put that all into your results section, and then you have a complete results section that should take up about 1 column of your poster.